In 1959, Peter Reyn-Bardt, a BOAC executive, met Malika de Fernandez. Peter proposed on the same day, and either 3 or 4 days later, depending on the source you're looking at, they married on the 28th of March. Within a year, Malika was missing. 24 years later, on the 13th of May 1983, 2 conveyor workers, Andy Mould and Stephen Dooley, uncovered a partially decomposed human head. Police confronted Peter about this, and he admitted to killing Malika in 1960. Peter Reyn-Bardt was gay. When he had met Malika in the late 50s, they each saw how marriage could benefit them both. Being married to a BOAC executive meant that Malika could travel, and being married to a woman meant that Peter wasn't at risk of losing his job or going to jail. Homosexuality wasn't legalised in the UK until 1967. Malika didn't learn of Peter's homosexuality until their honeymoon, but presumably soon after started demanding money for keeping quiet about it. Around 1960, she reportedly came to Peter asking for more when a row broke out, resulting in her death. Peter needed to dispose of Malika and first tried burning, but after the neighbours grew suspicious of the smell, ended up chopping up the body and burying the pieces in the bog at the end of his garden. After confessing, Peter Reyn-Bardt proclaimed, "It has been so long, I thought I'd never be found out," and showed the police where the rest had been buried, but they found nothing. Then the skull was sent off for carbon-14 dating and, much to everyone's surprise, was found to have belonged to someone who had died around 1,500 years earlier. After hearing of this, Peter tried to retract his confession, but despite his attempts, was sentenced to life imprisonment. Peter's now dead. As far as I could find, he died in Norfolk and Norwich Hospital on the 17th of August, 1995. In much of what I've read about him that wasn't written during the events, he's presented as somewhat a tragic and normal man who would have lived a completely happy life if he was just born decades later. However, when you look further into it, it becomes apparent that this might not be the case. There was a reason why the police questioned Reyn-Bardt about the skull. They had been told about it by a man named Paul Corrigan. In 1963, Reyn-Bardt moved from Cheshire to Portsmouth, where, in 1975, he met Corrigan. They became business partners, and together they owned and ran a pub. At some point during this time, Reyn-Bardt told Corrigan about how he had killed his wife. Sometime in the August of the following year, a 15-year-old boy was out on the streets of Portsmouth looking for his sister when he was kidnapped by the pair and taken back to the pub where he was tied up and raped. In court, they both pleaded guilty to this and 5 other offences and were sentenced to 7 years imprisonment. After only serving 4 of those years, Corrigan was freed and he moved to King's Standing in Birmingham, where he worked in the chippy. There he met the 16-year-old Derek McInnes, and in 1982, after weeks of scoping out schools and even doing a dress rehearsal, they kidnapped the 13-year-old John Haddon as he was walking home from school through Sutton Park. There was a huge search, and his body was found 30 miles away in a ditch off the A444 in Fenny Drayton in Leicestershire. The next day, Corrigan was found in the grounds of a children's home in Sutton Coldfield by the home superintendent. In court, McInnes described how they had killed Haddon by stabbing him with a hunting knife and was sentenced to 7 years. Corrigan was sentenced to life. In prison, he asked to speak with detectives and told them of Peter Reyn-Bardt's story. Peter Reyn-Bardt, who had been released later, was now living in Knightsbridge and was investigated. He denied everything, and as no evidence could be found, the case was dropped. Then, the following year, the skull was found, which pretty much brings us back to where we got to earlier. It seems like, though many have an opinion on Reyn-Bardt, they often don't really know as much about him as their confidence might suggest. This is particularly obvious in things published sometime after the events, which tend to neglect the more objectively evil things he did. In fact, the first book I looked at when beginning to research Reyn-Bardt, Lindow and the Bog Warriors, summarised all he did in Portsmouth with Peter Reyn-Bardt was doing time in jail for something else, and I initially felt quite sorry for him. Another article I found, though much later on, was a review of an episode of Horizon focused on bog bodies in the magazine The Gay Times. In it, they claimed that Reyn-Bardt had been accused and convicted solely on him being gay, and it criticised the BBC for being sympathetic towards homophobic police officers. It also described Reyn-Bardt as a victim of homophobia, which isn't necessarily wrong, but does massively oversimplify his story. I was unable to watch the episode, so I don't know what was actually said, but this review does show that somewhere along the line someone made a judgment of Reyn-Bardt based on flawed knowledge. Somewhat amusingly, it talks about how Reyn-Bardt was still in prison when he had actually been dead for almost 3 years at the time, which just further goes to show how people don't really know who Reyn-Bardt was but are still making judgments about him. I did find that in 2013, his great-niece was writing a book about him and was asking for people who knew him to get in contact, but I don't know what came of this. I also found a bunch of other stuff, but I wasn't sure where I could fit it in. This is because, while it is regarding Peter Reyn-Bardt and Corrigan, it is not really relevant to the skull. I did find them to be somewhat interesting though, so I thought I'd just list some of them here. I found an article from a few months before Corrigan's death describing how he had been let out of prison 4 times a month to wander unsupervised around the local high street and buy ice cream. It was detected that he had cancer in April of 2018 and it was removed. However, it spread more than they had realised, and when he got pneumonia, it was made worse by his remaining cancer and he died on the 11th of December 2018. Andy Mould, one of the 2 peat cutters who discovered the skull, was also one of the 2 peat cutters who discovered Lindow 2 the following year. It is now more famously known as simply Lindow Man and is currently on display in the British Museum. The skull, which is officially known as Lindow 1, is also stored in the British Museum, though it's not on display. Another bog body found in Lindow Moss in 1987, Lindow 3, is very likely parts of the same individual as the skull. The body of Malika, however, has still not been recovered. With Reyn-Bardt, he's the only person I could find who had that surname. He was born with the name Reyn-Bardt, but changed it at some point in his life. When I looked Reyn-Bardt up on both Google and Ancestry, he was the only person to come up. I also tried to look up what Reyn and Bardt might mean in other languages, but drew blanks. It seems like he just wanted something that kept a similar sound to his original name, but was still unique. That being said, most things I found stated that when he got married he used the name Edwin Reyn-Bardt. The Lindow and the Bog Warriors book I mentioned earlier says about how he anglicised his surname to Reyn-Bardt, but when I looked on Ancestry it said that he was born in Cheshire and both of his parents were from Suffolk with the name Reyn-Bardt. The final kind of relevant thing I found is that there's a music artist called Haircuts for Men, and in 2019 they released an album called 1983, and on that album is a track called Peter Reyn-Bardt. All the track titles of the album reference something that happened that year, including the events of the first season of Stranger Things. It's quite fitting that an album that mixes fact and fiction includes a track focusing on Reyn-Bardt.